Man frees elephant after 20 years in chains, its wounds break everyone's heart. The heavy iron shackles had worn grooves so deep into Raju's ankles that the metal seemed to have become part of him. For 20 years, the same 4 chains had bound his legs, their weight as constant as breathing, as familiar as hunger. The massive bull elephant stood motionless in the dusty courtyard, his enormous frame casting shadows that never moved far from the same weathered patch of earth. Wildlife rescuer Kartik Satyanarayan had seen many captive elephants during his years with Wildlife SOS, but something about this one stopped him cold. Raju's eyes held a stillness that spoke of surrender, not the wild alertness of his forest-born brothers, but the hollow patience of a creature who had learned that struggle only brought more pain. His trunk hung limp, barely swaying, while flies settled undisturbed on the raw wounds where metal met flesh. The elephant's mahout sat nearby, counting rupees from the day's begging. Tourists had paid to feed Raju sugarcane and crackers, unaware that his digestive system had been damaged by decades of improper food. Paper, plastic, and coins filled his stomach, offerings from well-meaning hands that had become slow poison. His ribs showed through skin that should have been smooth and gray, but instead bore the map of every beating, every spike, every moment when he had tried to remember what freedom felt like. Kartik approached slowly, his footsteps deliberate in the dust. He had learned to move like water around traumatized animals, to become part of the landscape rather than a threat. Raju's massive head turned slightly, one dark eye focusing on this stranger who carried no sticks, no hooks, no chains. There was no trust in that gaze. Trust had been beaten out of him years ago, but there was something else. A flicker of curiosity, perhaps, or simply the instinctive assessment of whether this human would bring more pain. The shackles had cut so deeply that infection had set in multiple times over the years, leaving ridges of scar tissue that would never fully heal. Each step Raju took created a soft metallic chime, a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to his captivity. The chains were too short to allow him to lie down properly, too heavy to forget, too tight to allow proper circulation. His feet, designed to carry him across vast landscapes, had swollen from decades of standing on concrete. Kartik knelt beside one of the chains, careful not to make sudden movements. Up close, the damage was even worse, raw flesh mixed with old scars, creating a bracelet of suffering that encircled each ankle. The metal had been welded shut, meaning it had never been removed, not once in 2 decades. Even during the scorching summer months when the iron became too hot to touch, it remained locked around Raju's legs. "We're going to help you," Kartik whispered, more to himself than to the elephant. Raju's ear flapped once, a small movement that might have been coincidence, or might have been the first sign that somewhere beneath 20 years of numbness, a spark of the wild still existed. The rescue team would need equipment, legal permits, a safe transport vehicle, and a sanctuary willing to take an elephant whose trauma ran deeper than his wounds. But watching Raju stand in his small circle of dust, seeing the resignation in his ancient eyes, Kartik knew that bureaucracy and logistics could wait. Some decisions transcend planning. They demand action born from the simple recognition that no living creature should endure such quiet suffering. The bolt cutters felt impossibly small in Kartik's hands as he positioned them against the first link of chain. 24 hours had passed since he'd made the promise, 24 hours of permits and preparation, but Raju remained exactly where they'd found him, standing in that same circle of packed earth, his massive body swaying slightly with each labored breath. The rescue team had arrived before dawn, moving with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that sudden movements could undo years of careful trust-building in a single moment. Dr. Yudharaj Kotpakar, the team veterinarian, approached with a syringe of mild sedative, but Raju's reaction was immediate and heartbreaking. His trunk curled defensively against his chest, his eyes widening with the kind of terror that comes from too many needles, too many procedures performed without gentleness. The doctor stepped back, recognizing what they all now understood. This rescue would happen on Raju's terms, or it wouldn't happen at all. Kartik knelt beside the first shackle, the metal warm from the morning sun. Up close, he could see how the iron had embedded itself into Raju's flesh over the decades, creating a fusion of metal and tissue that told the story of countless days when the elephant had tried to walk, to move, to remember what his legs were meant to do. The bolt cutters made contact with the chain, and Kartik began the slow, methodical work of cutting through links that had held for 20 years. Each severed piece of metal fell to the dust with a soft thud, but Raju's reaction was the sound that mattered most. At first, there was nothing, no movement, no acknowledgement that anything had changed. Then, as the pressure around his front left ankle began to lessen, he shifted his weight ever so slightly. It was barely perceptible, just a small redistribution of the massive bulk he'd been balancing in the same position for so long, but it was movement. It was hope. The wounds beneath the chains were worse than even Kartik had imagined. Layers of scar tissue had built up over raw flesh, creating thick calluses that had grown around the metal like tree bark around wire. Some areas had healed completely over the chains, trapping them beneath new skin. Blood seeped slowly from places where the metal had worn through to fresh tissue, mixing with dirt and forming dark patches in the dust below. "Easy, brother," Kartik whispered as he moved to the second shackle. Raju's trunk, which had remained motionless for so long, began to move with tentative curiosity. He reached toward Kartik's hands, not touching, but exploring the air around this human who worked without hurry, without violence, without the sharp commands that had shaped every human interaction for 2 decades. The trunk hovered inches from Kartik's shoulder, sensing warmth and intention, trying to understand this new kind of human presence. The second chain proved more difficult. The links had been bent and rebent over the years, creating a twisted maze of metal that required careful angling of the cutters. With each successful cut, more of Raju's weight shifted. His breathing changed subtly, becoming less shallow, as if his body was slowly remembering how to inhabit space without the constant reminder of restraint. The elephant began to rock back and forth, a motion so gentle it seemed like breathing itself, but it was the first voluntary movement he had made in the presence of humans in longer than anyone could remember. As the final link of the second chain separated, Raju lifted his freed front leg and placed it down again, testing the foreign sensation of movement without metal. The gesture was small, almost experimental, but it carried the weight of 2 decades of immobility. In that single step, barely 6 inches forward, lay the first quiet promise that somewhere beneath the trauma and resignation, the wild elephant who had once roamed free still existed. The third chain required 2 sets of bolt cutters working in tandem. Years of rust had fused the links into a solid mass of metal that seemed determined to maintain its hold on Raju's hind leg. Kartik worked alongside his colleague, their movements synchronized and patient, while the elephant stood with a stillness that had somehow shifted from resignation to something approaching anticipation. His freed front leg continued its small, experimental movements, lifting, placing, testing the reality of space without constraint. As the cutters bit through the penultimate link, something extraordinary began to happen. Moisture appeared at the corner of Raju's eye, a single clear drop that traced a slow path down his weathered cheek. Elephants weep when overwhelmed by emotion, their tear ducts responding to joy and sorrow in ways that bridge the species divide. This tear was followed by another, then another, until a steady stream marked his gray skin like rain on ancient stone. Kartik paused in his cutting, his own eyes filling as he witnessed this release of 20 years of suppressed emotion. Around the rescue site, other team members stopped their preparations to watch this moment that transcended the mechanical act of chain removal and became something sacred. Even the mahout, who had initially protested the rescue, stood silent and still, perhaps seeing his captive elephant clearly for the first time in decades. The final link separated with a soft ping, and the last chain fell away from Raju's ankle with a sound that seemed to echo across the courtyard. For a moment, nothing happened. The elephant remained motionless, as if he couldn't quite comprehend that the weight he had carried for 2 decades was truly gone. His trunk swayed gently, testing the air, reading the sense of freedom that must have seemed foreign after so many years of dust and confinement. Then, with deliberate care, Raju lifted his newly freed hind leg. The movement was tentative at first, as if he expected the familiar tug of metal, the sharp reminder that he could go no further. When no chain pulled him back, when no shackle bit into his flesh, he placed the foot down in virgin dust, inches beyond his established circle of captivity. "You're free now," Dr. Kotbakar whispered from several feet away. What followed was not the dramatic charge toward freedom that movies might suggest, but something infinitely more moving. Raju took a single complete step forward, his first true step in 20 years. His massive body swayed as he relearned the rhythm of unrestricted movement, each foot finding new ground, creating new patterns in the earth. The tears continued to flow, and several rescue team members found themselves quietly weeping alongside him. The transport truck waited nearby, ready to carry him to the sanctuary where he would spend his remaining years in peace. But in this moment, as afternoon light slanted across the courtyard and Raju stood with all 4 feet unbound for the first time since he was a young bull, time seemed suspended. The chains lay scattered in the dust like broken promises, and the elephant who had endured everything now faced the vast, gentle possibility of tomorrow.